Was there an Adam? Was there an Eve? Or did we evolve from what we conceived? Either way, we got what we needed when the sun shone down on the Garden of Eden.
Hey, everybody, this is Harvey Sluggo Wasserman, back for the 85th, count of 85, Grassroots Emergency Election Protection Coalition meetings. We are joined by 74 people to start, and we are going to be discussing the deeps of election protection. We're also going to have some discussion of the ongoing battle over renewable energy, which is the battle that parallels election protection in the world of energy. And at the end, we will be talking, of course, about Ukraine and the world-shattering events over there. This is engineered by Mike Hirsch and Steve Caruso, who's also our webmaster. Co-convener with us today from North Carolina is Joel Siegel. We've got Tatanka Bricka and an amazingly wonderful, as always, group of people. I do want to say that next week we will not be meeting. We will reconvene on March 14th. So we'll take a week off next week. We'll be back on March 14th, assuming that Vladimir Putin does not follow up with his threats to blow up the world. We are going to cover today. We started, and we will beforehand. We're going to get a brief explanation from Hal Ginsberg on the work our revolution is doing to prevent traitors and insurrectionists from getting elected to public office. We are then going to talk about gerrymandering in Pennsylvania. We're going to talk with Tatanka Bricka about gerrymandering being used against the indigenous. We're going to visit the astonishing situation in Ohio, where a single woman, the Maureen O'Hara, the Republican Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, has completely upended the gerrymandering process. It's a real profile in courage, if ever there was one. We're going to talk about Nevada as well. We're going to talk about the new nominee to the Supreme Court. Then we're going to go into what's happening with renewables. That will take most of the first hour, believe me. Talk about what's happening with renewables, and then we'll leave the rest of our time for Ukraine. I will admit, as I did in the preamble, that I have spent more time watching Fox News than at any other time in my life. Their coverage actually of this, when they're not talking to their partisan lunatics, has actually been pretty good. So that's the layout for today. We will go for 90 minutes on the recording, and then another 30 for kibitzing. As our engineer Mike Hirsch has pointed out, you please do. You can swear, but only in Yiddish. The 4 words we can't use. Okay, and for those of you who are Roman Catholic, you're welcome to try Latin as well. Tatanka, and then Joel Siegel. Tatanka Bricka.
Oh, I was just going to say Dan Nelson is in the house, so we're ready when you're ready for us.
Okay, very good. Joel Siegel from North Carolina.
Oh, hi, Harvey. I got a bunch of crazy work deadlines that I got to get done, but I want to see if I can go a little bit earlier than I was supposed to.
Well, you're set to talk about gerrymandering in North Carolina, and also
NPAC, the NPAC,
and report on NPAC. So that's fine. Let me see. We have someone. Well, Hal Ginsberg, you're going to give us a couple minutes on what you're doing, and then we want to talk. I understand we have someone from Pennsylvania to talk about the insane gerrymandering situation there, and then Joel, unless someone else really has to go, we'll slip you in. How's that? Okay. So Hal Ginsberg, you showed us some pictures beforehand, which wouldn't go over real well on the radio. If you can explain what your work is now, that would be great.
All right, Harvey, thank you so much. And I just want to give a quick shout out to Alberto in Los Angeles, who was at one of our first 14.3 action in LA when we were petitioning the Secretary of State of the great state of California to block Trump from the ballot. So it's pretty cool to see Alberto on this call. I was not expecting to. So good to see you, Al, and shout outs to you. What I was talking about before, and I'll just continue, is we did have 4 great events a couple of weeks ago, starting Tuesday in Annapolis, Maryland, and Mike Hirsch of PDA was speaking at that event. I showed a nice slide of Mike addressing the camera. We presented a letter to the Board of Elections Administrator for the state of Annapolis, Linda H. Lamone, urging her to investigate closely Dan Cox, who's running for governor on the Republican ticket for insurrection. And under the U.S. Constitution, if you take up arms against the United States, if you participate in an insurrection or you give aid and comfort to enemies, you cannot run for office. If you were in office at that time, you cannot remain in office. You cannot run for re-election. We believe there are a number of candidates in this cycle and who are in office now who should not be based on that constitutional amendment. And one of them is in Maryland, obviously Trump. And we are hoping to set a precedent going forward by getting insurrectionists barred on state ballots for 2024 to keep Trump off the ballot then, if possible. We're moving forward in other states, including Ohio, where we had a great rally Saturday, 40 folks braving the 15-degree cold, and it was very windy as well. We've been getting great media coverage in Ohio as well as in Pennsylvania. So we're really excited about this. We want to move forward in Arizona, where there are 3 bona fide insurrectionists who are running for re-election, including in Congress, Paul Gosar, as well as Mark Fincham. And the third one's name escapes me. I'm not going to sit here and try to remember. I believe it's.
So you are with Our Revolution, and we'll put in the chat how people can get a hold of you. You can speak it out real quick because we're on the radio.
Hal at ourrevolution.com. And Harvey, thank you and Mike for all your generosity of time. It's so appreciated.
Okay, no problem. We're glad to have you on, Hal, and keep up your great work with Our Revolution. And we are looking to pull together a definitive coalition and to proceed. I think one of the things we have to recognize right up top is that the work and the expectations that were put into a voting reform act, we're going to have a tough time given what's happened in Ukraine to get any kind of attention span from the Congress to help with that legislation to protect our elections. This is a big deal, something we're going to have to talk about. I understand we have someone on from Pennsylvania who has been dealing with the election protection issues and especially gerrymandering. Is that correct? Raise your hand, please.
Yes, I'm here.
Are that person?
Yep.
Carol Kunaholm, good to see you. Where are you, please?
I am in Chester County, Pennsylvania.
Okay, so you are right downwind from 3 Mile Island, and I hope you've survived. But let's proceed now. You're working on the extremely complicated gerrymandering fight in Pennsylvania. Tell us what's going on, please.
Well, it is very complicated. It's been fairly chaotic, but we are very hopeful about the outcome. We have a 5-person commission that draws the House and Senate maps. Our Senate map has been very gerrymandered for 30 years. The Republicans have locked in a 4 or 5 seat advantage every session for the last 30 years. In our Senate, the Republicans have locked in a 15 seat advantage for the last decade in the House. The decade before that, it was 7 or 8 seats. This time around, the maps that were drawn by this commission are far more fair and far more reflective of communities and have brought that partisan advantage much, much closer to zero. So there has been some outcry, as you might expect, from the party that was benefited by those gerrymandered maps, and they have taken it to the court to the extent that the House Majority Leader asked that the current gerrymandered maps be used again in this next election. The court very swiftly denied that appeal, which was terrific. So that appeal has just been, we will use the new maps. There's another week for petitions to be filed in opposition to the new maps, but the court has made clear they will move very quickly once all petitions have been filed. I think our new maps are the maps that will be in place for the next decade, which is terrific because the new maps are far better. So that's for our House and Senate maps. For our congressional map, our state legislature is supposed to pass a map and then the governor is supposed to sign it and that map becomes law. The state legislature ignored the other party completely, ignored the governor's instructions on what he was looking for in a map. They passed a map without explaining criteria, where the map came from, why they wanted that map, and the governor vetoed it immediately, as he had promised he would do, which meant that that went to the courts. And interesting, I don't know if this has happened in any other state. The Commonwealth Court, the judge it was given to, is a very strong Trump supporter, very partisan judge. She invited the parties to the, there were a number of parties who filed suit against the whole process, and she ended up inviting parties to submit maps, and there were 13 maps submitted, including the map that had been vetoed by the governor, including a map proposed by the governor, including some maps proposed by various citizen groups, 13 maps in all. And then that judge recommended to the Supreme Court stepped in and said, we're not going to let one Commonwealth Court judge choose a map for the whole state. The Supreme Court will do that. And so the Supreme Court did not. So the Commonwealth Court judge recommended the map that had been passed by the legislature and vetoed by the governor, which turned out to be the most partisan map of all the maps that were submitted. The Supreme Court stepped in and said, well, we're going to decide this. And last Wednesday came out with what they proposed was the final map, which we believe is a very fair map. It's not as partisan as any. I mean, there were maps that were more partisan on both edges. This was the map that changed the current map the least. So it was the least change from the map that was put in place in the 2018 League of Women Voters redistricting lawsuit. So that map went from our map that was passed back in 2012, locked in 13-5 advantage for Republicans, even in an election where Republicans had less than half the votes. They got 13 out of 18 seats. In 2018, the Supreme Court said that was unlawful. A special master drew a new map. That map gave
Carol,
9-9.
Which Supreme Court?
Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
The what? The
state? Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So that was
Okay.
actually a groundbreaking lawsuit because it appealed to the state constitution and looked at protections in the state constitution and went to the state Supreme Court, which was a terrific move because the U.S. Supreme Court has said they will not weigh in on partisan gerrymandering. The state Supreme Court said our Constitution gives us the right to free and equal elections. So on the basis of that Constitution, they ruled the previous map unlawful, gave us a new map that went 9-9 in a 50-50 election. We got 9 Republicans and 9 Democrats, and that's what we've had in the last 2 elections. And this new map follows that map very closely, except we lose 1 seat. So the new map looks like it will be very much, if the voters swing right, we will end up with the 9-8. If the voters swing left, we will end up with 8-9. Whichever party it swings to will get the extra seat. It's a very fair map. And so we look like we're in good shape. There are attempts to continue to litigate it, but from every indication we can see, we have final maps and they will be fair.
Well, wait till you hear what's happened in Ohio. But I mean, it's shocking what's happened in Ohio. Did you have a statewide referendum process to put how did this fair map districting happen?
So we tried very hard to get an independent commission in place. Pennsylvania does not have a citizen initiative, and to change our constitution, to change the process, we would have to get it to go through the state legislature twice and then go to a referendum. The legislative leaders, this is how they keep power, and they were not remotely interested in passing our maps, our proposals. They weren't interested in reforming the process, but we had many people paying attention to the process and put on a great deal of public pressure. Over 6,000 comments submitted to the commission that drew the maps, and lots of press, lots of letters to the editor, lots of attention. And I think that level of attention has forced pretty much everybody involved to move towards a more fair map, except for the Pennsylvania House, the GOP there. They know the only way they keep a majority is with a gerrymandered map. They have pushed back very hard, but the court has pretty much ignored them. And so we think that public attention and we think we have a fair Supreme Court, Pennsylvania Supreme Court, that takes the law seriously, that takes maps seriously. And our governor actually, I think, worked really well. He put together a commission to study the process and to propose guidelines. So I think a lot of public attention and the checks and balances that are embedded in our state legislature actually held firm this time around. We will continue to work for reform legislation, but for now, we are really pleased. We think we will have fair maps at the legislative and congressional level for the next decade.
That is astounding. You should be careful. You'll get kicked out of the United States. I mean,
Well,
that is truly amazing. How did it come about that you got this commission?
Well,
Where
the
did
commission is
come
embedded
from?
in our state constitution. So the state constitution says we have a 5-person commission. The commission is composed of the 2 majority leaders. So that's a majority leader in the House and Senate, the 2 minority leaders in House and Senate. The 5th person is chosen by those 4, but they never agree on anybody. And if they can't agree, then the state Supreme Court chooses the 5th person. So this time, the state Supreme Court actually chose, which the majority of the court, the state Supreme Court, is majority Democratic, but they chose a person who had been recommended by Republicans in the past, and the Democrats had voted against. He is an incredibly fair, he is a lawyer who was the chancellor of the law school at University of Pittsburgh. And so a man of great intelligence and great integrity. And he basically tried to run his commission by the rules that we had put in our legislation. So, having a great deal of transparency, inviting lots of expert testimony, tried to run it in as fair and open a way as he could. And we think the outcome is far better than we might have hoped for. It's not perfect. We think we might get an even better map if we had a citizens independent commission, but for the commission that we have really good maps.
That is astounding to hear. This needs to be written up. Somebody's got to write a major piece about this to put around. Carol, can you stick with us for a few more minutes?
I can say just a few more minutes and then I have to go. Yep.
All right, Joel, do you want to wait, Joel, or can you push your report back?
I wish I could, but I gotta pay
All
the
right, give
rent.
us a couple minutes, Carol, if you'll stick with us. We can't lose this thread. This is really critical because when you hear what's going on in Ohio, you're not going to believe it. Go ahead, Joel, real quick.
Yeah, I want to riff on, hey, Carol, it's an honor to meet you. What you're doing is, I think it's very heroic and it's a model, but the election protection movement is really starting to mature now. But I think if we're going to push back against the far right wing, we have to professionalize the operation. And we need a national organization with a $500,000 budget that can do what you just did, Carol, but do it across the country where there's, gerrymandering. And because you have to shame these elected officials. And if you don't shame them, they're going to do the wrong thing every time. But let's say we had an organizer in North Carolina, we could replicate what you did in Pennsylvania or something similar and just say, you know what, we're going to start our own commission. It's going to be a civil society commission. You get a lot of press, start lobbying, the General Assemblies and say, we don't want this anymore. But anyway, that's the one point I wanted to make. How do we professionalize this operation and replicate Pennsylvania, which is what I think Sluggo was getting at. Number 2, Hal's work is pretty astounding and needs to be lifted up. But I'd like to suggest that we do a sense of the House resolution, and I think we should introduce in the Senate as well. I put it in the chat. Whereas Donald Trump did everything to break the law on 1/6, therefore be it resolved that he should not be able to run for president. Because you also got to shame the House and the Senate. If you don't shame them, when I worked there for 13 years, most of the staff were young kids, and the chief of staffs were very conservative, even in the Progressive Caucus. They didn't want to make any waves. and I love to make waves, and we got to make those waves for them. And, you know, our revolution could get probably 100 co-sponsors right away on that kind of a resolution. But my fear is that we're going to mainstream authoritarianism, and we can't do that. So lastly, about NPAC, National Progressive Action Coalition, I want to thank Tatanka and James Fukuda. But when we had our first meeting, I can't remember when it was, a few months ago, we had 127 organizations who agreed that the progressive movement cannot remain in silos. And I'm working in the nonprofit world again, and I am seeing the siloization of the progressive movement is often being perpetrated by well-intentioned NGOs who are vying for what they think are scarce foundation grants, which is not true. There's plenty of money. It's just they're not asking for it in the correct way. But what we're trying to do with NPAC, we're going to build a board of directors.
Joel, tell us, what is NPAC? And put it in the chat.
National Progressive Action Coalition, which is an attempt to unify progressives under one big umbrella, as opposed to the siloed nature of it, which renders the progressive movement
And how do people plug into NPAC on this call?
I'm gonna let Tatanka talk about that.
Okay.
I'll close by saying that there's a very deep constituency for this idea of a unified coalition for three reasons. Number one, progressives are realizing we don't have enough critical mass to rapidly transition to 100% clean renewable energy because of the opposition. And everybody knows who the opposition is. Number two, we can't really stop authoritarianism and voter suppression on the state level, much less the federal level, without more power. And then also just, equity across the board. I'm running a campaign to end homelessness, and I can tell you most homeless people don't have any advocates, very few. And we're trying to change that. But every time we do a new campaign, you guys start from scratch. We want to have like a rapid response network, combine our efforts with PDA, with GREEP. But it's coming along very nicely because people realize that we have to do this or we're kind of doomed. I don't want to be pessimistic,
Okay.
But yeah, I'm done. Thanks.
Well, no, it's great. It's great. So you want Tatanka to tell us how to connect? Tatanka, we're going to come back to you in a couple minutes. I fear we're about to lose Carol. Thank you very much, Joel. We appreciate that. Stick with us as long as you can. Carol Kunaholm in Pennsylvania. How do we coordinate with you directly? We need to, just like the Georgia Miracle, we need to spread the actual word about what exactly happened in Pennsylvania and how we can replicate this.
Well, I would say there's groups across the country who are at work on this issue, and every state is different. So it's hard to know how to replicate. We talked a lot with the California Independent Redistricting Commission, but they got there through citizen referendum. We watched Michigan and their voters, not politicians, with great envy because they collected signatures and then they got on the referendum. We are working hard to figure out how to force our legislature to listen to people. And that's a challenge that we continue to work on. But I would say public attention is a great disinfectant. The more public attention you can get on the process, the more people you can get to think about maps, the more you can force the process to deliver maps that are more fair. And that's just really hard work of educating the public. We've had over 1,100 public meetings attended by over 42,000 people. Wow. And we've recruited, volunteers across the state. We actually have volunteers in every single legislative district in the state, and we have 253 legislative districts in Pennsylvania. We have volunteers in every single one of them. We trained people to meet with legislators in every single district. So it's kind of a grassroots movement. It's convincing citizens that civic engagement matters, convincing people that they need to pay attention to state legislatures. And I think one of the big challenges is that people don't think state legislatures matter that much. And so we've tried hard to help people understand that the things they care about most are usually decided at the state legislative level. And we continue to do that work.
Well, who is we? What is your group?
We started out as a coalition. We're actually a fiscal project of the League of Women Voters, and there are League of Women Voters groups across the country who are working on the gerrymandering issue. But we quickly became a, there we are, Fair Districts PA. We are just volunteers, and we are a completely volunteer-led, volunteer-staffed organization of people who just bring all their experience and frustration to trying to help people understand why these things matter. So a lot of us are retired educators, retired lawyers, retired policy folks, or people who just have been watching Pennsylvania for years and saying something is broken here and trying to understand what's broken. And once we say, hey, connect the dots, the things that you care about aren't getting done because the legislature is not listening to us, and they're not listening to us because they are in safe districts where they don't have to listen to us. So we try to connect the dots, and we try to educate people and help people to really see why it matters to care about the state legislature. And it is all about communication.
So we need to have, within a month, we need to have a national Zoom gathering, and Carol will organize it in conjunction with you and people in other states on gerrymandering. Because this is the kind of, I mean, you're talking about in Pennsylvania, you're talking about shifting 5 or 6 congressional seats just by shoring up the fairness of the districting process. And,
well, that was the lawsuit. Absolutely. That lawsuit in 2018 was part of the shift in the House of Representatives. We went from, as you said, 13 to 5 to 9-9. That was four seats. That shifted, and we're holding on to that. We're holding on to the fairness going ahead. People weren't sure that we would be able to hold on to that, but we absolutely are. So
okay, we will be sure. Please write me Solartopia@gmail.com, and we will pull this together. This could not be more important. We want to move ahead. I know you may have to leave.
I do. Carol, thanks for having me so much.
We're thrilled. We want you back in 2 weeks, please. And we will proceed with this and really try and link together a lot of these different states. Tatanka, you're with Danny Paul, and also I have Steve from Ohio. Danny Paul and Tatanka, can you stay with us? Because I want to talk about Ohio before we go to the indigenous. Is that possible?
Can you, Danny Paul?
I'm good for now. Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay. So Steve Caruso and I have spent a lot of time in Central Ohio. The scenario that we're going to describe, you could not make up. And Steve, correct me if I get it wrong, but a while ago, I believe the League of Women Voters was also, and I love the League because my mother was in the League the whole time I was growing up. And the League of Women Voters and other groups in Ohio won a statewide referendum to revamp the gerrymandering, the districting process. And it was a good, sane, fair process, and it moved ahead. And the Republican legislatures, both houses, which is completely gerrymandered. Ohio is, 52 now, maybe Republican, 48 Democrat, but the both state legislatures, both state houses have super majority Republicans, even to the right of the Republican governor, John Kasich, and slightly, but not much to the right of the current governor, DeWine. And they went in there and they completely blew up the citizen process that was put in place by a very strong majority of Ohio voters. And they came up with a map that was even worse. I think Ohio was, 12-4? A state that was 50-50 was 12-4 Republican or thereabouts to go along with the supermajorities in the 2 state assemblies. And so they drew up this map, and with a Republican governor, and the Republican governor, so classic of this guy, Mike DeWine, comes out and says, well, this is a really lousy map. This is embarrassing. And then he signed off on it. And, they send the map up as per legal requirement to the Ohio Supreme Court, where everybody, and I mean everybody, assumed that the Ohio Republican Supreme Court, which is 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats, was going to rubber stamp this thing. And suddenly, Maureen O'Hara, may that name live in history, the Republican Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, threw out the map. And the Republican Party literally had a heart attack. And they went completely crazy, screaming at Maureen O'Hara, charging her with gerrymandering. I mean, and she's in her last term. But, for her to do what she did was a real profile in courage. If John Kennedy was alive to write a second book, she would be the first chapter. And so the Republicans went completely crazy, and the governor's son is on the Ohio Supreme Court. And so the Republicans got together, they drew up an equally lousy map, sent it back, and she vetoed it again, the second time. And with the situation in Ohio, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, they are in danger of not having elections in Ohio because there's no maps. Nobody who's running for the state house or the Congress knows where they're running.
Well, they actually approved the map. They actually approved a map without the Democrats voting on it because they didn't agree. There was no cooperation between the two, the Democrats or the Republicans, in the commission that was voted into place by a referendum of the people of Ohio. And so now the Supreme Court, they dropped the case where they're going to charge the people that didn't cooperate with contempt on Tuesday. Well, that's been pulled back. Okay, now the Republicans are going national, trying to get states' right issue recognized at the Supreme Court, which they just turned down in Alabama. So you tell me what's going on.
Right. So in Alabama, the Supreme Court of the state of Alabama threw out gerrymandered maps that were completely racist. And the U.S. Supreme Court, 5-4, because Roberts voted the other way on this, left in place maps that are completely racist. Now the Ohio Republicans are trying to get the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn the state Supreme Court. And this guy, Mike DeWine, the governor, was supposed to be in front of a hearing for contempt because he was part of the process. And his son, who's on the Supreme Court, had to recuse himself because he couldn't overhear a trial of his own father. So now you have, instead of 4-3 at the Supreme Court, which everybody expected in Ohio to be 4-3 Republican, it turned into 4-3 Democrat, or at least against these maps, and now it's 4-2 against the maps because DeWine's son is gone. And meanwhile, there's no election possible. Nobody can run for Congress, and nobody can run for the state house because there are no districts. And nobody knows how this is going to end. There's no likely solution here. Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, no, yeah, well, you covered it pretty well. I mean, right now we're looking at this lawsuit, and whether the contempt of court thing is going to pop up again, I don't know. Maybe they got pressured to just pull it. Maureen O'Hara is going to be replaced, and I think Jennifer Brunner is running for a place.
There's a Democratic woman who's running for. I don't know if she's going to win, but that doesn't happen till the fall.
Well, she's in there now.
Nobody knows. We're talking about, this is Ohio, in the middle of the United States of America. You have a completely failed state.
Well, you look at it and they have these polls and they say like 60% of the Republicans. Well, the Republicans are only like 30% of the people. So how much, so take 60% of 30%, what do you get? It's just this little thing, this little cadre. And all these guys in Ohio that are running Republican are Trump associates now. I'm a Trump guy. I'm this.
But anyway, so that's the situation in Ohio. You just heard a completely sane report from Pennsylvania, and right next door, you have a failed state. It's like Ukraine next to Belarus. I mean, it's absolutely insane, and we have no idea of where this is going to go. There's no likely solution. However, early in the process, and this is really instructive, a citizens group, a group of citizens groups, actually drew up a map that they thought would be fair. And I think that's a very important step forward. And it looks like something that we should do, because you have this crazy Republican map that's completely gerrymandered and rigged, but at least out there, and everybody's yelling about it, but at least out there, there is also a fair map that you can hold up to the rigged map. So, stay tuned, folks. 2 weeks from now, we'll be revisiting this. Maybe it will be resolved, but this is March. And you cannot, in November, under this current circumstances, have an election. It's astounding. Not for the state Senate, not for the state House, and not for the U.S. House.
We have Cliff Albright in the House. He needs to speak about redistricting and the black vote.
Oh, black votes matter, yes. And then we'll go to, we'll get a question from Justin, and then we'll go to a place where it's even worse, which is with the indigenous. And we'll have Tatanka and Danny Paul talk about that. Cliff Albright, go ahead, jump in, please.
Hey, thanks for having me. Thanks, Mike. So I'm Cliff Albright, co-founder, executive director of Black Voters Matter. And I'm here basically was on an email thread with Mike and bounced around an idea that we've been talking to. Let me take a step back, because I'm not sure how many folks on the call, are familiar with the work that Black Voters Matter do. We are a power building organization. We focus on building power in predominantly Black communities. We believe that elections and electoral organizing is one way of doing that, but not the only way of doing that. And so the way we go about engaging in our work is that we support local groups. We do work in 23 states, 11 of those where we actually have at least one staff member. Most of those are in the South, and all the way from from Texas, running all the way across over Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, the 2 Carolinas. And then we have 2 states up north, one of which you were just talking about in Pennsylvania and one in Michigan. Again, those are our core states where we have staff members. And there's 12 other states where we have a light touch, where we don't have staff, but we support local groups. And when I say support, that means, we support them on strategy, on GOTV, on mobilizing, on advocacy around voting rights. We've got an entire part within our policy sharp that deals with redistricting. That's part of what I'm gonna talk about today. And we don't just focus on the congressional redistricting and those maps that have been drawn. We've been providing support to local groups that have been dealing with their local state and their local redistricting. The previous speaker, a couple of speakers ago, talked about how, all roads run through these state legislatures, and we believe that, but we also believe that they run through these county commissions and these city councils, and that those maps are important too. And a lot of local groups don't often get support around that redistricting process, because the national dialogue is always at the congressional level. And so we get these groups support, strategy, financial resources. Sometimes we travel around in what we call the Blackest Bus in America to provide some support. And texting and tools and things of that nature. Over the past year, we've been very deeply involved in the battle for voting rights. Somebody talked about the Georgia miracle. We're based in Georgia. We were very much involved in the Georgia elections, both the presidential as well as the 2 Senate runoffs that took place in January, the day before the insurrection. And so with all that said, we were active in the battle, and I see you putting up the website. We were active in the battle around the voting rights legislation. We were part of the group that was outside the White House for months, doing rallies and protests to get President Biden to finally come out and speak about filibuster reform and to take a clear, unequivocal stance on that. He finally did that. We continue to push along with many other groups, many other partners, some which may even be on this call, but you mentioned the League of Women's Voters earlier, People for the American Way, Transformative Justice Coalition, Legal Defense Fund, so many partners that have been working together, DFAD, Lawyers Committee, Leadership Conference. And, we were part of keeping it on the radar so that the Senate could have the historic debate and take the vote that it took, which obviously fell short. And so that's why I'm here today, because as we're going about and we're talking about redistricting and we're talking about the current election cycle and we're trying to mobilize voters to come out, what we don't want to have to happen is that we don't have an answer to the question when somebody says, well, we did all that in 20 and Georgia folks did that in 21 and got 2 Senate seats. And you said that if we had the Senate, we'd be able to get some good stuff passed like voting rights, but that didn't happen. So why should we do it again? How do we know the same thing won't happen? And we've got to be able to answer that question. So one of the things that we've been floating and talking to partners within the coalition about is coming up with a voting rights contract or a voting rights compact or a voting rights pledge where we basically get anybody running for Congress, particularly the Senate, but maybe the House as well, but particularly the Senate, since we know that's where we need 2 extra votes in order to get voting rights passed. But we come up with this compact, that's a package of 4, maybe 5, maybe even 6 bills that would be pledged to ahead of time, so that when folks come to get our votes and when they win and go to DC, that they don't wind up going there and then we think that they're there to pass voting rights, but then they say, oh, I never said that. Oh, I never said anything about filibuster reform, right? It's got to be the basis of accountability. So we're thinking about a contract that would have at a minimum the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that would have the Freedom to Vote Act on it, or the For the People Act, because we've been saying that, look, the original ask was the For the People Act. Manchin then came up with the compromise and then had the audacity to betray his own compromise. And so if that's the case, and we're going around him now, that we don't even have to deal with his compromise, we go back to the original ask, which is the For the People Act. And so the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, Freedom to Vote or For the People, either one, we'll figure it out. The DC statehood, because we very much believe that DC statehood is a voting rights issue. Filibuster reform, because at the end of the day, all this doesn't mean anything if they promise to support the bills, but they don't support filibuster reform, cinema, then that doesn't get us very far, right? And then a 5th one that we've been talking about, which is lesser known, some of y'all on here may know it since you've been talking a lot about redistricting, but the Fair Representation Act, we believe that it can be an important contribution to the discussion around voting rights. Some of you may know it deals with federal redistricting, but by changing the nature of how districts are drawn and how people are voted in, proportional representation combined with ranked choice voting. From my personal perspective, it brings me back 30 years ago to when Lonnie Guinier first tried to have a national debate and a national discussion around proportional representation. The entire country would have had a chance to have that debate if Bill Clinton had not withdrawn her nomination and not given her a chance to defend her position in a hearing. Instead, they allowed her to be coined and referred to as a quota queen. That's not what proportional representation is about. Okay. The Fair Representation Act would be a chance to have that discussion. That is still up for some discussion because some people aren't quite as familiar with it. But at the end of the day, it's the notion of having a voting rights contract that we wanted to introduce.
All right, these are all great things. We're really thrilled to have you on, Cliff. If you'll put your contacts in there, we'd like you to join our coalition on gerrymandering at very least, and Black Votes Matters. It's really good to have us in this coalition and on these calls. I hope you'll become a regular. Join us again in 2 weeks, and let's see if we can aim towards a national gathering that includes your group on gerrymandering. Okay, is that cool? Put everything in the chat. Justin, you have a question, and then we're going to move on. It's already 6 o'clock, for God's sakes. We're going to move on with Tatanka and Danny Paul. Cliff, where are you? What city are you in?
I'm based in. We're based in Georgia. We're in Atlanta.
Okay. All right. Mm-hmm. Very good. All right. And of course, you work with Ray McClendon and all the people down there. Justin LeBlanc, real quick, please.
Thank you, Cliff, for everything that all you guys have done for that Georgia Way Coalition. that really is a model to the rest of us, along with what was mentioned before, Voting Rights Michigan, formerly Voters Not Politicians. I wanted to give some context that the initiative process that Michigan used in order to get its Citizen Redistricting Commission came out of an episode in Ohio. Way back when, during the labor rights movements, the railroads had actually pretty much beaten down the state government and were going to override rule of law there. And around the country, citizens got fed up and put initiative processes to override their legislatures. That's something that we really need to emphasize in terms of all these Republican attacks on voting rights and all these Republican attacks on the electoral systems that we have, is that our country already went through that process, and we rejected this idea that legislatures have absolute power. The citizens do have their own power. We need to stand up and take it. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Justin. A very strong 2 cents worth, as usual. We're over 80 people on this call right now, for those of you in radio land. We want to move ahead now to, thank you again, Cliff. We want to move ahead to Tatanka and Danny Paul. If you thought the situation on gerrymandered in Ohio was crazy, Tatanka and Danny Paul, can you go on, explain to us what's happening with gerrymandering in Indian country?
Before I introduce Danny Paul, I'm going to bring him up on the screen here too. I want to say to Cliff, we'd also love to have you as part of that National Political Action Coalition. And you may or may not know Drew Glover, who is the national coordinator of it, and we see as the future executive director of it. He lives right there in Selma and was the Selma Bridge Crossing director last year, and former city council person in Santa Cruz, who was removed by a very, very nasty $500,000 outside money campaign to get rid of him. Okay, and also you asked me about NPAC and Joel and how people, I will put my either Joel Siegel, joel.r.siegel, or Drew or myself. I'll put those in the chat so you can contact us if you are a progressive organization, you represent that organization, or if you're a progressive activist who's really concerned about working on this and getting other organizations involved. Our next meeting of the steering committee, which you're welcome to, is this Thursday, 2 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Eastern, and it's a Zoom call, and we will get you on the mailing list. Okay, I want to welcome Danny Paul Nelson, Dan Nelson of the Romero Institute, actual son of Danny Sheehan and Sarah Nelson, who started the Christic and the Romero Institute. And Dan has been working for a decade with Lakota People's Law Project, and all things Lakota, has worked with all the leadership there. And he's the one that's going to bring us up to date on what's happening with voting rights and what may be transpiring in the near future. Take it away, Dan.
Thanks, Tatanka. Thank you, Sluggo. I'll try to keep this brief given how busy everyone is. The honest truth is that I've not developed expertise yet in the gerrymandering currently happening in Indian country, Sluggo, so I can't give a thorough update on that. I have, of course, heard from colleagues that it's not good. Arizona, for example, is taking a significant hit. Probably most of you remember that Trump ended up winning that state by about 10,000 votes. And if you look at the map of where Biden's votes came from in the state, they're largely from tribal nations. There are about 250,000 Native American people that live in the state of Arizona, and they gave that election to Biden. And if counted up across the nation, I think it's fair to say that the Native vote swung it in general. It's true of lots of other constituencies as well. But Native people are about 2% of the population, and they made a difference in a lot of states, including Georgia. This coming election, we're actually looking. I work with people at Standing Rock. My co-director Chase Iron Eyes is a former congressional candidate from North Dakota, the first Native American to run for that position, and we have a very close relationship with the current chairwoman who was just elected at Standing Rock, first woman to serve in about 60 years. And we did a huge voting project with Standing Rock around the 2020 election. We spent a couple of months putting together a phone bank there that ultimately made about 250,000 phone calls into states like Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and ultimately Georgia. So we are thinking about resurrecting something on that scale for this year. We're looking at states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, New Hampshire, Georgia, and Arizona, all states where things are very tight. And we believe that in all those states, the native vote could make the difference. And at this last election, 2020, first time that a victorious presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate acknowledged the native vote, I think, in history. It's never happened before, at least to our knowledge. So things are improving in Indian country, certainly, but the poverty is endemic and it's severe. And so it's not simple to solve these challenges. So we're going to be chipping away at it this year best we can. We're actually involved in a lawsuit against the state of South Dakota as we speak as a plaintiff for their failure to implement the National Voting Registration Act. So it's called Motor Voter. It's a law that requires that DMVs and other state agencies that receive federal funding, provide voter registration opportunities to people as they come in. And the state has been just wantonly ignoring that law. And so we're probably going to end up settling with the state and getting things to shift somewhat there. But in any case, there's just a lot to keep eyes on. And, we're going to be doing our best, and I will continue to return to this forum and provide updates about the work that we're doing. I'll just mention in closing very briefly that there are exciting things happening at Standing Rock right now in connection to the Dakota Access Pipeline fight that many of you are going to be intimate with. Back in 2016, 2017, of course, the entire world's focus was on Standing Rock because of the effort there to shut down construction of that pipeline. The good news is that the Biden administration is finally talking to the tribe. There's going to be a meeting this coming Wednesday, actually, where they sit down and talk about whether the current environmental impact assessment process is adequate. About 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court actually basically affirmed that that pipeline is illegal, that it was not built according to the National Environmental Policy Act. And so there's a lot of momentum at this moment, putting pressure on that pipeline. The challenge, of course, is that Dakota Access represents about 5% of domestic oil production. With what's going on in Ukraine, it's not a good moment, probably politically, for us to be getting pipelines shut down, but we're going to try our best and argue that, North Dakota is an example of a state that's got enough wind to power the entire Midwest, and yet they still get 75% of their power from coal. It's completely unacceptable. So the idea that somehow we don't have options other than oil, of course, doesn't hang together at this stage in the process. So we're gonna have to push on that particular lever. Anyway, that's the update that I've got for now, Sluggo. Thank you for the time.
Okay, so we know that the as you said, that the indigenous vote made the difference in getting Biden to carry Arizona, and the Republicans aren't happy about that. Especially in North Dakota, you have a extreme right-wing woman in the governor's mansion, but the indigenous community has been essential. I will point out that Native Americans were not actually granted the right to vote by the U.S. Congress until 1924. So although you've been here 20, 30,000 years, haven't even been voting 100 years. It's astounding. And I have said this before, but I had a guy named Mark Welsh, an indigenous activist who used to come to my classes and speak. And he went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1989 when they were hearing the case on peyote. And the question was, would indigenous be allowed to use peyote as part of their religious ritual? And Mark Welsh heard William Rehnquist, then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, say literally, quote, "The First Amendment does not apply to Native Americans," close quote. So there you go. So at any rate, we will keep you in the loop. Gerrymandering, of course, is a big deal in Indian country. And this pipeline, since I've been watching Fox, they're all saying, I heard Mike Pence say, and he specifically mentioned Keystone, saying that, we got to open all the pipelines. And, just remember one thing, oil has absolutely nothing to do with electricity. And so, we don't generate oil with electricity. Natural gas is a different story. So if these people are saying that we need this oil for electricity, it's a total lie. I think I mentioned Hawaii, of all places, the only place only state in the country that gets a significant amount of its electricity from oil. So let's leave that besides. Okay, last week we had someone, thank you so much, Danny Paul. Tatanka, do you want to add to that?
No, that's cool.
Okay, so for those of you in Radio Land, we have 85 people on the call. We had a woman from Nevada last week. Is there anyone else from Nevada or another state that was involved with gerrymandering? We are going to pursue gerrymandering in a very, very focused way on these gatherings. Based on the contrast between Pennsylvania and Ohio that we've heard today, clearly we can make tremendous progress. I do want to acknowledge Dennis Bernstein is on with us, the great host of Flashpoints, now nationally syndicated from Pacifica. Dennis, if you want to chime in, raise your hand. Anna Georgie from Western Mass, Thomas Pogge from Yale. Rebecca Landau. Rebecca, you're in LA. I hope you will come along with the other Californians and Angelinos to our gathering on March 27th in Beverly Hills. And we have both Angel and Wendy from Florida with us. It's great to see both of you. And we're going to get into the energy issue. I do briefly want to mention a new law that staggers the imagination. Just when you thought you've heard everything. The state of Texas is now moving forward with a law that states, I can barely say this, and maybe some of you have heard this, that if you know someone, a child, whose family is allowing that child to have transgender treatments, hormones and whatever else is involved, if you know about it and you don't report it, you can be convicted of a felony. I have to repeat that because I said it pretty much correctly. And they're doing this with abortion too. This, as a historian, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm married to one. But as a historian, I have never seen this anywhere in the history of the United States, where a state requires you, if you know of a woman having an abortion, or if you know of a child doing transgender therapy, and you do not report it, you can be convicted of a felony. This is a whole new invasion of our legal rights. And it has not yet, in that particular form, it did go to the US Supreme Court in terms of abortion. In other words, the Texas law that states, it's the vigilante law, where they don't rely on the state to enforce it. They force people, neighbors. I mean, this is right out of Nazi Germany, but they force people who know that someone is having an abortion to report it or else face criminal charges. And the Supreme Court kicked the law down the road, but did not overturn it while they're waiting to decide. And to that, they have added the vigilante enforcement of anti-transgender treatments. So I don't know where to go with that, but it has to be on the agenda. This is a whole new way of enforcing fascist laws, if you can call them laws. I wouldn't distinguish them as laws, but that's what they are. We have a medical doctor to comment on this, Ruth Strauss. Dr. Ruth, do you want to say something about this?
Hey, thank you. Just two quick things. The first is that the Women's Reproductive Health Bill, which is Senate 3755, it's ridiculous when you look at the Senate calendar. They voted to get it out of committee, but in any case, they're going to start discussing it on the floor today at 3 p.m. Please call your senators, okay? I think the Capitol switchboard, if you don't want to look it up, is 202-224, I think it's 3121, I'm not sure. But anyway, the other thing is that on March 8th, which is International Women's Day, there is going to be a protest about all of this at City Hall at 2 p.m. It's sponsored by Rise Up for Abortion Rights. please try to be there and try to get your friends to be there. Thank you.
This is in Los Angeles?
Yes, that's in Los Angeles.
Okay. Well, what is the federal bill? I'm not clear on the federal bill.
It's 3755. It basically says a woman has a right to abortion and you can't go after doctors if they give them.
Was there an Adam? Was there an Eve? Or did we evolve from what we conceived? Either way, we got what we needed when the sun shone down on the Garden of Eden.